The UN rights chief's message as the war in Gaza approaches 1 year.
Ending the war and averting a full-blown regional conflict is an absolute and urgent priority.
The upcoming American election weighs heavily on the minds of Ukrainians.
I wonder who will win, and in general, what will be the policy towards our country. This is what I'm interested in, and God grant that both of them will support us.
And later, Secretary of State Antony Blinken is headed to England. Russian mercenaries leave Burkina Faso, and a typhoon strikes Vietnam.
Today is Monday, September 9th, and this is VOA's Flashpoint.
Good evening, I'm Steve Karish, along with Lori London. The Israel-Hamas war continues to claim lives as analysts warn that the suffering won't end unless a ceasefire deal is achieved. Although a truce is still elusive, the United States hinted that a more detailed peace proposal will be made in the coming days. VOA's Veronica Balderas Iglesias has the story.
Security was tight Sunday at the border between the West Bank and Jordan after a gunman opened fire against Israeli security forces at the Allenby Bridge crossing. 3 Israeli civilians and the shooter were killed. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu condemned the attack, believed to be linked to the Israel-Hamas war.
It's a hard day. A despicable terrorist murdered 3 of our citizens in cold blood at the Allenby Bridge. On behalf of the government, I send my condolences to the families of the murdered.
Israeli troops continue their operations against Hamas targets in Gaza over the weekend, as Palestinian health authorities reported that at least 40,939 Palestinians have been killed since the war began. Unless a ceasefire deal is reached and implemented, the suffering on both sides is expected to continue, warns Rick Stoll, Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Rice University in Texas. He spoke via Skype.
People will still be getting killed. I think hostages will not be released. I don't see a way that Israel can defeat Hamas. They would be better off trying to achieve some kind of a settlement now.
A similar sentiment was expressed on Saturday in Tel Aviv by relatives of those captured in the October 7th Hamas terrorist attack that killed 1,200. It was the first time that the families protested alongside anti-government demonstrators. Ifat Calderon's cousin is one of the hostages.
If we want to make a change here in Israel, we got to go out and shout for stop the war and for a deal now.
As a mediator, the United States can only do so much to help bring lasting peace to the region, analyst Stoll says.
I don't think we have a significant amount of influence over the parties. I think they are doing what they think is best for them.
The head of the CIA, William Burns, did announce on Saturday that a more detailed ceasefire proposal will be made in the coming days. Veronica Balderas Iglesias, VOA News.
Ending the nearly year-long war in Gaza is an absolute priority. That from the UN Human Rights Chief Volker Turk on Monday, citing an opinion released by the UN top court in July that called Israel's occupation illegal, something Israel has rejected.
States must not and cannot accept blatant disregard for international law, including binding decisions of the Security Council and orders of the International Court of Justice, neither in this nor any other situation.
Turk also noted the threat of the conflict becoming a full-blown regional war and the ongoing humanitarian suffering.
We know that wars spill over and into future generations, fostering repeated cycles of hatred if their causes remain unaddressed.
His comments were given in a broad speech marking the midway point of his 4-year term as UN rights chief, where he described massive challenges around the world and a crisis of political leadership.
Meanwhile, in northern Israel, a residential building in Nahariya, a coastal city north of Haifa, was hit by a projectile on Monday after air raid sirens warned of an attack from Lebanon. Israeli media reported the building was hit by a drone. That's Lizzie, a resident of a nearby building. She was already displaced in Nahariya after her hometown was evacuated following the October 7th attack on Israel. She told journalists she took cover in a safe room when she heard the explosion.
Moving now to the war in Europe, many Ukrainians are hoping the outcome of the U.S. elections will bring an end to Russia's war on Ukraine, while some worry that Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump will take a softer approach on Moscow. Others are concerned that under the policies of Democratic presidential nominee Kamala Harris, aid, while significant, will be too slow to arrive. Anna Chernikova reports from Kyiv.
In the capital, Kyiv, and elsewhere in Ukraine, people wonder and worry about the outcome of U.S. elections and how it will affect their war-battered homeland. Some residents, like Angelina, express hope.
I have expectations that the future president will support us, our politics, our military actions.
Other residents, like Dmitro, are worried.
I wonder who will win, and in general, what will be the policy towards our country. This is what I'm interested in, and God grant that both of them will support us.
The biggest fear is that the new U.S. administration will end its support and abandon Ukraine in its fight against Russia, says political analyst Mykola Daviduk.
Turning a once democratic country into an autocracy costs millions of deaths, and this is what the country is afraid of.
After 2.5 years of war, a key factor affecting morale in Ukraine is the uncertainty of what is to come under a new White House administration. Trump promises to end the war quickly, and many fear that means Ukraine would be forced to make too many concessions if he returns to office. At the same time, Ukrainians remember that Trump as president approved the sale of Javelin anti-tank systems that help Ukraine fight Russia at the start of the full-scale invasion. The Obama-Biden administration had rejected Ukraine's request for those weapons in 2014, when Russia invaded Crimea and took over much of eastern Ukraine's Donetsk region. But feelings among Ukrainians are mixed, with some like Svetlana fearing a Trump victory.
Trump is such a strange man, and he has quite strange thoughts.
And others, like Ivan, find reassurance based on past experience.
Trump was already president. His methods are known, and there's nothing to be afraid of, I think.
The U.S. under the Biden administration has been generous with Ukraine, spending $175 billion to support it since the start of the full-scale invasion. But there is frustration among Ukraine's leaders who say the aid has been slow to arrive.
The Russian army is now trying to take advantage of a situation when we are waiting for supplies from our partners, especially from the United States of America, and that is exactly why the speed of deliveries means stabilizing the front.
Analysts say if elected, Kamala Harris' policies would likely be like Biden's, and the prospect of continuity is reassuring to some. But it makes others nervous that the war could drag on. A poll by the Razumkov Center in Kyiv finds 44% of Ukrainians surveyed think Ukraine and Russia should start peace negotiations soon, but most responders see Putin's conditions as unacceptable. With fatigue building among Ukraine's top supporters in Europe, many here see the U.S. elections as more of a lifeline than ever, albeit one that is not entirely certain. Anna Chernikova, VOA News, Kyiv.
In a related story, Russian mercenaries hired to provide security in Burkina Faso began leaving the country late in August to help defend Russia against Ukraine's insurrection. Data show the mercenaries have made little impact in the Sahel's war against Islamic terrorist groups. As Henry Wilkins reports, Burkina Faso saw one of the deadliest militant attacks in recent years the same week the Russians left.
Militants killed between 100 and 300 people in this August 24th attack on a town in northern Burkina Faso. It was one of the deadliest in the Sahel by groups linked to the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. It came the same week a group of Russian mercenaries known as the Bear Brigade announced a partial withdrawal from the West African country to help counter Ukraine's incursion into Russia's Kursk region. One expert told VOA the mercenaries had been assisting with personal security for Burkina Faso's military leader, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, and government officials.
Their withdrawal raises a lot of questions about what will happen to the security of these Burkina Faso officials, who, it must be said, are facing a number of challenges.
Since September last year, Traoré has fended off 2 attempted coups, according to authorities. He came to power in a 2022 coup himself, claiming the previous military junta had failed to turn the tide in the country's war against Islamic militants. He also ended military cooperation with France and left the regional political bloc ECOWAS, enlisting the help of Russian mercenaries to aid in the war effort instead. Russian intervention has not stemmed the rise of Islamic terrorist groups in the Sahel, but Ian says.
It's true that the situation today continues to be bad, since the Burkina Faso army is being pushed out of large swaths of land in many parts of the country with the rise in power of Jnim and ISIS.
In recent years, Russia has also sent mercenaries to Mali and Niger. Deaths from conflict have increased by 26% in the 3 countries in the last year. Data from the non-profit Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project show. Henry Wilkins, VOA News.
You're listening to Flashpoint from the Voice of America. I'm Lori London with Steve Karish in Washington. Typhoon Yagi is wreaking havoc in Southeast Asia. We'll find out more soon.
Now, though, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken makes his way to the U.K. on Monday. Following 14 years of Conservative Party rule, there's now a more left-leaning government in London. And while there are clearly more similarities than differences between Prime Minister Keir Starmer and President Joe Biden, the supplying of weapons to Israel has sprung up as one of those disagreements. For some more context, I'm joined by Henry Ridgwell in London.
I think first and foremost, this is a visit for Antony Blinken to Britain under a new government. Of course, under Prime Minister Keir Starmer, Antony Blinken will meet the Foreign Secretary David Lammy. And he said, or the State Department said, it's really to reaffirm the special relationship between Britain and the United States and to work on some key areas of policy together, not least, of course, dealing with the ongoing conflicts in Ukraine following Russia's 2022 invasion, and also the crisis in the Middle East and Israel's war on Hamas militants in Gaza as diplomatic efforts continue to try to bring an end to that war as well. But also on the agenda are relations with China and Indo-Pacific security issues, which perhaps may be a little more difficult, whereas the US, for example, is imposing tariffs on the import of some Chinese goods, including electric vehicles. Britain is looking for a stronger trading relationship with China and is holding off trade measures like that. But, of course, both countries are working together on security in the Indo-Pacific region, on the AUKUS security relationship as well with Australia. So there will be plenty to talk about within the 2-day visit, and we expect both David Lammy and Antony Blinken to hold a press conference Tuesday.
Keir Starmer's government is the first British government in well over a decade that wasn't run by the Conservative Party. Joe Biden has a lot more in common with Keir Starmer than he does his predecessors, but there's one key difference, supplying the weapons to Israel. Is that a particularly sore point of disagreement? Will that come up?
I think you will see both Antony Blinken and David Lammy and Keir Starmer as well, although we may not hear from him directly, try to minimize the differences in policy between the US and the UK on this. But, it is a clear point of difference. Britain, after a months-long legal review that started towards the end of last year following Israel's attack on Hamas militants in Gaza, launched a legal review of its supply of weapons and concluded last week that there was a risk that some of those weapons could be used in activities that could breach humanitarian law, and therefore around 30 licenses were withdrawn. Now, the United States has come to a different conclusion, and it has said that it doesn't believe that any international laws on war or humanitarian laws are being breached by its supply of weapons to Israel. There will be questions on that, undoubtedly. I think both sides will seek to minimize that and will look to talk about those common points where they are both demanding a ceasefire, both from Israel and from Hamas militants in Gaza, where they are both working towards a solution, a ceasefire on that.
Blinken and Biden clearly have more in common with Keir Starmer than his predecessors. What about the British public? Are they receptive to American influence, to the American ideas that Blinken might be discussing?
Yes, I think there is, a broader agreement with the approach that the US is taking, although, you see differences in public opinion in polling that is done, for example, on the approach to the Middle East, particularly on the US support for Israel. As we've mentioned, the US is still supplying around 70% of the weapons that Israel is importing. There is deep distress in the UK over the loss of life in Gaza, as there is around the world. And perhaps there is greater public support in Britain for a tougher line on Israel, for a demand that the conflict in that region ceases. But I think more broadly, there is agreement in Britain with the US approach to Russia and Ukraine, with the US support for Kyiv. And indeed, last week, the US announced $250 million of extra support for Ukraine. There is concern here in Europe as well over the level of European support. Last week, Germans voted in state elections for parties that opposed sending more military aid to Kiev. Now, those were state elections, not federal elections. It won't affect the German state policy immediately, but there is a growing sentiment in Europe of a feeling that perhaps Europe can't afford to keep this level of support for Ukraine going. Perhaps it's time to try and find a solution and an end to the fighting so that this war doesn't go on forever, and so that European support doesn't go on forever as well. And of course, that's a sentiment that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has been fighting hard against, and saying there is a need to take on Russia here and to confront them and to stop them at the Ukrainian-Russian borders. So broad agreement, I think, on that. There will be between the Labour government here in Britain and Antony Blinken. And I think there will be a reaffirmment on both sides of a special relationship as Britain seeks as well to raise its profile in the international stage after years, really, of bitter political infighting within the government and within the Conservative Party. Under a Labour government, they're looking for a new approach.
VOA's Henry Ridgewell in London. Henry, thanks for your time. Thanks for your reporting.
Good to be with you. Thanks, Steve.
At least 48 people died in Nigeria on Sunday after a fuel tanker collided with a truck carrying travelers and cattle. David Doyle of Reuters has more.
Dozens of people were killed on Sunday in a fuel tanker explosion in north-central Nigeria, officials have said. The Disaster Management Agency in Niger State said the tanker had collided with a truck carrying travelers and cattle. A spokesperson put the death toll at 48 and said officials were still trying to clear the scene. One emergency worker said they didn't know how many animals were involved and were still trying to extract them from the wreckage.
That's David Doyle of Reuters reporting for us.
The weather appears to be impacting the Chinese economy, and it's not good news. Francis McGuire of Reuters has the story.
Extreme weather stirred up Chinese consumer prices in August. Inflation accelerated to the fastest pace in half a year last month. But the uptick was due more to higher food costs from weather disruptions than a recovery in domestic demand, meaning deflation remains the bigger worry. Official data Monday showed the consumer price index rose 0.6% from a year earlier last month, against a 0.5% rise in July, though it was below analyst forecasts. Extreme weather this summer, from typhoons to deadly floods and scorching heat, has pushed up farm produce prices, and that contributed to faster inflation. State media said crops affected by various natural disasters totaled 1.46 million hectares in August. Food prices jumped 2.8% on the year that month, from an unchanged outcome in July, while producer prices fell at their fastest pace in 4 months. A tough start in the second half has put pressure on Beijing to roll out more support measures. The economy faces a prolonged housing downturn, persistent joblessness, debt woes and rising trade tensions. In unusually strong comments last week, former Chinese Central Bank Governor Yi Gang called for more efforts to fight deflationary pressure. Global brokerages have also scaled back this year's growth forecasts for China to below the official target of around 5%.
That's Reuters' Francis McGuire.
And in Venezuela, opposition presidential candidate Edmundo Gonzalez flew into Spain on Sunday to seek asylum amid a political and diplomatic crisis over July's disputed election. Typhoon Yagi, Asia's most powerful storm this year, is barreled across northern Vietnam, killing dozens and inflicting widespread damage to homes and infrastructure as it churned westward. The country's weather agency has warned of more floods and landslides. We hear more from Sean Hogan with Reuters.
Typhoon Yagi left dozens dead in northern Vietnam as it barreled westwards, preliminary government estimates showed on Monday. The country's infrastructure has also been hit by Asia's most powerful storm of this year, as the weather agency warned of more floods and landslides. Widespread damage could be seen in the Vietnamese capital Hanoi on Monday, with downed trees covering the streets and signs ripped from their hoardings. The typhoon swept across Vietnam's northeastern coast on Saturday, cutting power to millions, flooding highways and disrupting telecommunications networks. This usually busy bridge in Phu Tho province was swept away. Authorities said initial investigations suggested there were 8 vehicles on the bridge when it collapsed. Despite being downgraded to a tropical depression on Sunday, Yagi has brought a halt to economic activity in many industrial hubs. Managers and workers at industrial parks and factories in Hai Phong, a coastal city of 2 million, said on Monday that power was out and equipment was being salvaged from the rain. These pictures show an LG electronics factory, the walls of which collapsed following the typhoon's impact. Local resident Bui Van Thuy began cleaning up the damage to his shop on Sunday.
The damage done to this community is extremely severe. Most of the roof was blown away or the ceiling caved in. It may take 3 to 4 years for this place to look the same again because the damage is so terrible. The surroundings look like an apocalypse. Never before has a storm dealt this much damage to us.
State-run power provider EVN said 75% of the 5.7 million customers that lost power over the weekend now had electricity restored.
Sean Hogan of Reuters reporting.
An out-of-control wildfire in the foothills of a national forest east of Los Angeles threatens tens of thousands of buildings and has already forced hundreds of residents to flee. All this as temperatures were over 38 degrees Celsius for several days. The fire is burning along the edge of the San Bernardino National Forest. It's about 105 kilometers east of Los Angeles. As of Sunday, the blaze has already charred about 70 square kilometers.
And that ends today's program, but there is more VOA coverage 24 hours a day on our website, voanews.com, and across our social media platforms. On behalf of Steve Karish and all of us here at VOA, thank you so much for listening. Until tomorrow, I'm Lori London.
For deeper dives and expert analysis, listen to VOA Podcasts. Issues in the News explores the biggest stories every weekend, while International Edition keeps you informed every weekday. Plus, with the 5-minute newscast at the top of every hour, you're always up to date.